January the 29th, 2025. Washington, D.C. The night, one of the calmest, coldest times of the day. The city lights illuminated the darkness, while a thin layer of mist covered the Potomac River. The air was calm. There was no wind. Everything seemed ordinary. The calm sky over Washington, D.C. was, however, the herald of an impending catastrophe. This cold night over the Potomac River would bear witness to one of the most tragic incidents in American aviation history. This tragedy was not just a collision, it was a disaster born from the combination of human errors, systemic failures, and insufficient measures. The start of the night. American Eagle Flight 5342. American Eagle Flight 5342 was en route from Wichita, Kansas to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. There were 64 people on board, 60 passengers and 4 crew members. The flight was operated by PSA Airlines using a Bombardier CRJ-700 aircraft. The flight was proceeding as expected with no abnormalities. The Bombardier CRJ-700, a regional aircraft, is frequently used for shorter flights and has a seating capacity of 70 passengers. Despite its high safety standards, even the safest aircraft can encounter problems in an instant. As the plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., everything appeared normal. Pre-flight checks were completed, weather reports were reviewed, and the pilots were performing their duties with their usual diligence. However, the sky above was hiding some complex problems. At the same time, another story, UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. At the same time, an UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter, belonging to the U.S. Army, was conducting a night training flight. The helicopter was flying south along the Potomac River. The darkness surrounding the river was mirrored in the helicopter's movement. Inside, there were 3 crew members. The Black Hawk was carrying out an important military exercise, but it was flying at an unusually low altitude. The Black Hawk, a military helicopter, was flying much lower than the safe altitude designated for such operations. This wasn't just a technical error. Communication issues and environmental factors made this situation more complicated. The helicopter pilots had reported their altitude as 1,100 feet, but radar data indicated the aircraft was flying at a lower altitude. 8:47 p.m., the moment of the catastrophe. At exactly 8:47 p.m., the 2 aircraft met over the Potomac River. At the same point, 2 different vehicles, with 2 different purposes, were in the air. Each was on its own trajectory, unaware of the other. But one thing they didn't know: time was running out. The right wing of American Eagle Flight 5342 struck the tail of the Black Hawk helicopter. In that instant, chaos began. The impact caused both aircraft to lose control. The pilots and crew fought for their lives as the planes and helicopter descended rapidly into the dark waters below. This was not just a collision, it was the moment when lives were lost and futures were shattered. Both aircraft lost control and rapidly plummeted toward the cold waters of the Potomac. As the planes spiraled downward, the chances for the passengers and crew to survive were slim. Within moments, the planes were submerged beneath the river's surface. The aftermath was about to unfold. After the crash, the swift arrival of rescue teams. Immediately after the crash, emergency response teams were swiftly dispatched to the scene. However, the cold temperatures and ice in the water made it difficult to locate the wreckage. The debris was scattered across various parts of the river, with some parts even being dragged to the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. Rescue teams battled the frigid weather and frozen water to reach the site. Despite all these efforts, no survivors were found. The National Transportation Safety Board's NTSB investigation. After the crash, the NTSB, FOA, and U.S. Army launched a joint investigation. The black boxes were recovered from the water and analyzed. It was determined that there were no errors or violations in the flight procedures of the CRJ-700. The pilots of the aircraft had followed all protocols. However, it was found that the helicopter pilots had not provided the correct altitude, and that there were significant communication failures between the tower and the helicopter. In addition, the investigation revealed that there were only 2 air traffic controllers at the tower during this incident, and the heavy air traffic contributed to the communication disruptions. Media and public reactions. The crash quickly made headlines in the media. People were trying to understand how such a tragedy could occur. The grief and sorrow spread across the country as the once peaceful skies of Washington, D.C. would never be the same again. The questions raised centered around how civilian and military air traffic could be coordinated more effectively. In the aftermath of the crash, families of the victims, especially those of the 20 young figure skaters and their coaches, mourned their losses. These weren't just athletes. They were young individuals with futures full of promise, dreams, and hope. They were part of a community, part of a team. Their lives were suddenly taken from them, and their families were left to deal with the profound impact of their absence. Night training flights and safety. After the crash, it became clear that night training flights needed to be made safer. The need for mandatory radar warning systems, especially for night flights, was emphasized. This was seen as the first step in preventing similar incidents. Additionally, the staffing levels in air traffic control towers needed to be reconsidered, as it was found that the low number of controllers contributed to communication failures. The people who lost their lives, more than just numbers. The people who died in the crash were more than just statistics. They were lives, they were stories, they were hopes for the future. The 20 young figure skaters, who were en route to a national competition, were not just athletes, they were future stars, and in an instant, their futures were lost. The aftermath and the lessons learned. Following the crash, the NTSB concluded that the tragedy was preventable. The investigation uncovered multiple systemic flaws and human errors. Among the recommendations were improved coordination between civilian and military flights, mandatory radar warning systems for night flights, and increasing the number of air traffic controllers in towers. One question: who is to blame? That night over the Potomac River, the sky would never be the same. Not only did lives end, but a fundamental issue was revealed. What factors, what mistakes, led to this catastrophe? Pilot error, air traffic control failure, or was this tragedy a result of systemic failures across the board? This crash highlights that there isn't just one culprit. Instead, it's a failure on many fronts. Perhaps the true lesson from this disaster lies in a critical evaluation of teamwork, coordination, and human factors in aviation safety. Leave your comments below. If you have any thoughts on the questions raised by this tragedy, leave them in the comments. And if there's another aviation disaster you'd like to learn more about, let us know. Maybe in the next video, we'll tell the story you've chosen.